So friends, in the first part of the discussion, the kind of atmosphere, cultural atmosphere that has been evoked by Dr. Richa Bajaj will be now seen in the light of specific poetry of Allen Ginsberg, and she has picked up the poem Howl, and let's see what it is, what it stands for, what strategies it uses, and what kind of role it plays in life, and how it inspires people not only in America but in the rest of the world. So over to Dr. Richa Bajaj, please take it up.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So, Howl and Other Poems was actually published in 1956 when Ginsberg published his first book, and he laments this intellectual and moral turpitude in America, which was caused by the culture of this kind of crass consumerism. So, consumerism was the new kind of deal that he was trying to counter through his work. So, and he projected in his poems in general also, he projected in his poems the state's insensitivity towards the populace and the kind of lack of trust and faith that was that was the result of this kind of insensitivity of the state, and the kind of complete dehumanization of the people that pointed to a larger malaise. So, I think this is what also defines a Ginsberg poem in general, and his style, as far as his style is concerned, he's he experimented with the form of poetry, keeping it open-ended and viewing it as a kind of an unfolding process, and not trying to complete it, and there wasn't this kind of neat formal classicism that you found, for instance, in the earlier poets. Also, he was trying to get away from the obscure poetry. His father was very much against T.S. Eliot, and he charged T.S. Eliot for causing this kind of obscurism in American poetry. So, there is this sense of a new kind of a poetic model that Ginsberg sought to bring about, which was prosaic and at the same time used this kind of jagged line, the jagged line and the uneven flow. So, the lines would just abruptly stop. So, you would see a lot of enjambment and other things, and yet there was this kind of a natural speech rhythms that he followed, which was poetry of direct expression, and I had a colloquial style, but it was an intense poetry. So, there are so many ifs and buts to it, that there are jagged lines, uneven flow, but yet there is the flow which is of natural speech, right, and of expression, and it is intense poetry, but again using very colloquial sort of a style. So, I think in terms of the form of poetry, this is what and he mostly writes in free verse, so there is that kind of, and again I can see a lot of Whitman over there that you can see in his poems. Apart from that, some of the key points that one must remember when one is dealing with Ginsberg's poems is that anger and frustration of the youth is at the center of most of his works. There is a kind of a critique of the consumerist culture that you see in his works, a kind of an evocation of a popular culture or an alternate culture in his works, which may also be called subcultures or countercultures. You could use any of these, but something that challenges the mainstream culture of the time. There is intensity of feeling, emphasizing an emotional truth, and that is what is most important for Ginsberg. Whatever you find in his poem, a lot of it you might find is gibberish often, or is in a way something that doesn't make sense, or there are things which are just put together, but they are guided by the emotional truth of the poet, and that is what keeps the feeling and the high emotional quality of the poem keeps the flow going, or keeps the rhythm also going. So, these were poets who experimented with the form, and they believed in experimentation. They also believed in these kind of psychedelic experiences that could enhance their consciousness. There were also poets who were votaries of sexual liberation. So, these are some of the and along with the idea of the spiritual quest, the spiritual quest, and which is attained both through religion and the natural world. So, they would often go and live, like for instance the transcendentalists of the 19th centuries like Thoreau and all, they would often go and live in these obscure places and see life afresh in the natural surrounding. And again, poets who were against this kind of social conformity, I think taking from Rousseau kind of model, where they believed that society was coming down on them heavily, and in order to live their lives fully, they required this kind of individual freedom. So, they were votaries for this kind of a lifestyle as well. So this in a nutshell, just very quickly, I've just thrown some points so you can build on them later and research on them more. But now if I take you to one of the examples, for instance, and I take it from the poem Howl, you can see on your screens this poem itself. I'll read some sections, and this is the beginning, which is now the most, one of those famous beginnings that we often speak of in poetry. It begins with, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Unquote. What do you think?
No, of course, he is not bothered about the niceties of life. He's not talking about the flowers. He's not talking about trees.
Right.
He's not talking about music. He's talking about the actual life that exists before him.
Yes,
And
he's not a poet of beautiful language.
Yes.
In fact, he's quite, Howl was, I said, charged because it had a lot of, it was seen as something that was abusive almost, So there are sections where people thought that the normative code of conduct was not being followed, and it could have a negative impact on people. So he doesn't care really to bring in beautiful projections or beautiful language. His language is direct, and you can see it's prosaic. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, and then it gets poetic. Madness, starving, hysterical, naked, those are the words that define his generation.
that's hardly poetic, but
Yeah.
he makes it poetic.
Makes it poetic. But again, there is a sense of pathos here. There's a sense of tragedy that is there in the poem Howl. Again, Howl is very close to scream. Whether it's scream or howl, it is a sense of a cry. It's a cry to be heard, and this is the time when these poets wanted.
Howling of a jackal, howling of a kid.
Also, howling of a kid and howling of a jackal. You very rightly put, because at one place in Howl, he talks about Moloch. Moloch is the god, is considered in Hebrew Bible, is considered to be the god that demands children's sacrifice.
Oh, yes.
So, when you say howl of the child, then it also gets connected to that. So, it requires the sacrifice of the child. And he says, who is Moloch? Moloch is the state. Moloch is the government.
I pronounce it as Moloch. So I was at a loss as to what you're saying.
Right.
Yes.
So, then there is...
Moloch also occurs in Paradise Lost as a figure. Anyway, please continue.
Yes. So, again, there is this kind of, the howl in that sense becomes a cry of all those innocent people. So, here children of the country, so innocent people who then need a sense of direction, or then need and want themselves to be heard. Right. So, and howl of the animal, of course, also being as a part of it. The point is that these people are all direction, and why are they destroyed? He's saying the best of minds, the best of my generation is getting destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, and they don't know. They lack a sense of direction. Therefore, they are dragging themselves and looking for an alternate, fix, an angry fix.
I can think of the power of Walt Whitman here, to whom we have made reference. That he's talking about eye, he's talking about the widening eye, the scope, and he's able to take the heroic aspect of life in a different sense.
Yes, right. And these people, for them, these people are hipsters who burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, he goes on, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of city contemplating jazz. Now, you see, there is a sense of he's just throwing in words, and you can see there is no grammatical connection. It's not like he just, for the first time, he talks about, I saw the best of my mind, best of my generation, and everything else gets connected with who, so who poverty tatters, and again, who poverty and tatters what, right? So he's not making any sentences out of it. He's just throwing in words, and automatically they seem to make sense. Contemplating jazz, supernatural darkness of cold water flats, right? What does that mean?
It's a very powerful phrase.
Yeah.
It sends a kind of challenge to us to make sense of it.
No, but also supernatural darkness of cold water flats, right?
Yes.
These are flats which are all in the dark. You know, I'm also reminded of Tennessee Williams, for instance, play The Glass Menagerie, where, you know, there is this family living in a kind of a dingy apartment which has no natural light, and is always its actual entrance is the fire exit, which means they don't even, these people are so hidden in the crannies of America that you would not even find them. So they are in supernatural darkness of cold water flats. You know, you don't get hot water there. So it's about privation. It's about the kind of conditions that people live in, floating across the tops of cities. You know, so you will never see them. There are some hidden in the back stairs, in the fire exits, in the, you know, without any entry. And all these people are contemplating jazz. They are thinking of poetry, they're thinking of art, they're thinking of life, and what is available to them is poverty and tatters. These are the words that he gives us in the poem.
Really very powerful poem.
Yeah, and it goes on and on and on. You can see it as a kind of a, you know, as a kind of a frustration of the poet, that he goes on talking about this problem. And, you know, Howl created a sensation when it was published. It has these long extended lines, of course, and, you know, it expressed the poet's radical non-cooperation with this kind of official culture. And you can see that, you know, he's still talking about the generation when he talks about who, again, the who is the clause that keeps joining with the rest, you know, the stanzas, who plunged themselves under meat trucks looking for an egg.
See, just see the details, they don't converge.
Yeah.
They go astray.
No, plunge, they need an egg to eat.
Yes.
So they plunge themselves under meat trucks, which are full, but the meat truck is not for them. They plunge themselves under these meat trucks without caring for their lives, just for that one egg. And there is above them this meat truck that has nothing for them. That meat truck is to go elsewhere. It's to cater the rich. You can see this kind of a dynamic, that these are the people who plunge themselves under the meat truck looking for an egg that they can sustain themselves on.
Life's opposites are brought together, and there they create a kind of flash.
Right. I spoke about the shining and suffering America.
Yes.
The shining and the suffering America come together. You know, and build a sort of a narrative. I'm reminded of the Indian poet Gajanan Muktibodh, who talks about, I am the mechanic who's working under your Chevrolet Dodge, right?
So there is
the opposites, right? Similarly here, there are these people who plunge themselves under meat trucks looking for an egg. You know, so these are the people who would be run down, you know, would be mowed down by these trucks on the way, looking for a small scrap of food. And while there are meat trucks going loaded for people who are rich and wealthy. So I think this is the kind of a juxtaposition that exists over here. And again he goes on, who threw their watches off the roof to cast their ballot for eternity outside of time, and alarm clocks fell on their heads every day for the next decade.
See the range.
Imagine.
Yes. The sense of time, the sense of clock.
Who threw their watches off the roof to cast their ballot. You know, they thought this government will work for them. For eternity outside of time, and alarm clocks fell on their heads every day for the next day.
They don't offer any facility to the people.
Yeah.
And they've been dreaming of all these things.
No, the point is that alarm clock fell on their heads every day for the next decade means that alarm is set for them to go to work. That alarm is set for them, it is a reminder that please get up and get going.
It's very explosive phraseology.
Yes, explosive also. There is dream, and there is that dream which is crushed. You know, and then of course it becomes violent also. Like he says, who cut their wrist 3 times successfully, unsuccessfully. Give up and were forced to open antique stores where they thought they were growing old and cried. So, you know, these are the people who cannot make sense of their lives, and finally they just grow old and they cry, you know, and this is how he keeps on building in this poem, you know. So there is, when he's talking about boys sobbing in armies, old men weeping in the parks, children screaming under the stairways, all of these are different ways in which Howl need can be interpreted. Right? That children screaming under the stairways, boys sobbing in armies, old men weeping in the parks. This is the reality of America. But on the other hand, this is what the culture, the idea that is given to us is this fancy photo where everything looks up and the world wants to go to America and make a living.
So which means prosperity is becoming obscenity.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, very rightly put. And this defines society for him. It is this state that is incomprehensible. It's a kind of a prison. He calls it a soulless jailhouse, and he calls it stunned governments, right? So, and blood and money. So, these are the words that he uses and links
together.
all of them, whose blood is running money. So, all these are instances where you find that there is the authority and the crackdown of the authority, and on the other hand, all these helpless people who are somehow managing to dream are lost and are destroyed. Basically, the word is destroyed, and the whole poem is about this kind of destruction, and that is what defines Howl. Now, I'd like to take you to another poem of him just to give you a sense of a different kind of poetry that Ginsberg wrote. It is called A Supermarket in California, right? And look how he evokes Walt Whitman there. He says, "What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman. For I walk down the side streets under the trees with a headache, self-conscious, looking at the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit supermarket, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches and what penumbras, whole families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in avocados, babies in the tomatoes. And you, Garcia Lorca, what were you doing down by the watermelons?"
Just see, he brings in poets and writers from other places, puts them together, and they all represented humanity.
Yeah. So these are writers who he really liked, Whitman, Lorca, a Spanish poet who was assassinated just before the civil war in Spain in 1936. But again, these writers had alternate sexualities, and which is why also Ginsberg liked them, because he himself was trying to deal with that alternate kind of sexuality. So you find, but what is more intriguing and more interesting here to note is that the new world that America is, of supermarkets with neon fruits, all day night the supermarkets are open and families are out there, and in this world Ginsberg is as lonely and lost as Whitman, and he says, and I quote, "I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely, old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys." Right?
That's what Whitman has become in the 20th century.
20th century, and that is what Ginsberg also is to a large extent. He is childless, lonely, old grubber.
And they are together.
And they become one, so he's in a way walking with Whitman. This reference to Whitman and Lorca in the poems in a way revives a different history, a different America that stood for other things than supermarkets and happy families of this kind who are indulging in it, and he says, and I quote again, "Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America? Of love past blue automobiles in driveways, home to our silent cottage?" This is the question he's asking Walt Whitman, that will we stroll dreaming of the lost America?
And the answer is
of
negative.
Love.
The answer is negative.
The lost America of love is what is the key phrase here, and past blue automobiles in driveways. Everybody has a house and has a driveway and has these fancy cars, home to a silent cottage. I don't live in these driveways, houses, home to a silent cottage. This is what the two Americas again get positioned here. But this is what he's talking about. Our dear father, greybeard, lonely, old courage teacher, what America did you have when Karen quit poling his ferry and you got out on a smoking bank and stood watching at the boat disappear on the black waters of Lethe? Unquote. Again, the idea that Ginsberg is talking about this Whitman's America that is now lost in oblivion. and people have tasted for him in the 20th century in this kind of a culture. People have tasted the waters of the river Lidi and forgotten their history, because Lidi is the river of forgetfulness and of oblivion. It is one of the 5 rivers that leads to the underworld, right? And Carrion is the ferryman who takes the dead souls across the river. So here you see how America's, that it has lost, it's become blind, and the kind of reminder being offered by the vision that Walt Whitman had of America. These are the 2 things that I wanted to put together, and to show you a kind of a more again, you can see a tragic note even in this poem, Supermarket. It is not as violent or as abusive or as obscene within quotes as Howl is, because he is not angry here, but he is definitely bemoaning the loss of the America of love that was inclusive, that fought for the rights of people, that fought for equality in the 19th century.
So through the maze of so much of misery, he is able to also find the expression of love, which is the requirement of the time.
Right. So, which is why I said that, I didn't want him to be tagged as just this kind of a poet of the Howl variety. There is another variety, and this is written around the same time, So, in a way, his range is different. He is dreamy, sad in one, but angry and frustrated in another. And Ginsberg's poetry then negates this kind of normative code of conduct. Or any kind of constructed mainstream truths or social truths which are constructed truths, which are not the reality. He finds some comfort in spirituality, but there is no this sense of, it's not the poetry of the beautiful in that sense.
You use the word spirituality twice or thrice. How do you see it, visualized by this person in his poetry?
I think it's more to do with his interiority, and a sense of finding the answers, because I think Ginsberg has been largely has been dissatisfied with all the answers that are available. Whether it was his father's position as a poet romantic, socialist, or his mother's position who belonged to the Communist Party, or his friends who were in one area or the other. He did not want to find,
or to his Jewish heritage,
and even in this eclectic group, he was trying to find a pattern, and that pattern in a way was offered by this kind of a spirituality or religions of other cultures, that threw light on life as such. So I think because he has remained dissatisfied with every other explanation and answer and could not adhere to any one particular philosophy, he found the Buddhist philosophy, for instance, the mainstay of his existence.
Still there is, because nothing exists at the same time, there is always the urge to exist.
Yeah.
And that is perhaps spiritual.
Right. Also the higher truth, his poetry is also about trying to get to a higher state of consciousness. And that higher state of consciousness, I think, is the spiritual angle that you can call in his poetry. Yeah.
That comes around 60s, 70s?
Yes, that is when he begins to travel towards the east. So yes, it is the latter part of his, but it's not like he is moved in one direction and never returns, because he also writes in the 70s and 80s, he talks about, the fall of the states and the fall of the, of America. So in that sense, he's returning to that same, at the point of Howl again in his other poems. So it's not like he moves very far away from one particular type. He keeps coming back to talk about the fall that has occurred of the states in America and bring them in his poetic projections.
What you mean is that there is no apology in him for what he wrote earlier.
And there is, like in his poems, which like he wrote Reality Sandwiches in 1963. He wrote a poem called Kaddish, which was written in 1961, which was about his mother. And it's a confessional poem written in the IU style, where he's addressing his mother, and he's like, who was dealing with insanity and later death. And he was trying to come to terms with that kind of reality. So the 60s poem deal with are confessional in vein as well, where he's trying trying to go into the IU format and is personal in that way. When he turns to the poems of 1965 to 72, then he's talking about the fall of America. That's his other collection, and it's subtitled as Poems of These States. So this poem actually got him the National Book Award for Poetry in 1973. So it's to say that he is still coming back to the country, to his people, and trying to talk about social protest and relate the lives of the ordinary people who live and who inhabit these spaces, and talk about how America has finally fallen, in the 1970s for
so
him.
at least there is a movement towards sadness, to melancholy, to some kind of lack of courage that he had earlier. Now he accepts things. Can he be charged with that in the latter part of his poems?
I don't think so. In the sense that he may not be as
Energetic.
fiery as he was in Howl, for instance, of the 1950s. He may not be that, but he's more meditative, of course, when you come to the 1970s, but his heart is still in the right place. I think he's still talking about the issues that he feels very strongly about, right? Even different explorations and different kind of exposure to different cultures in the East may have brought in a kind of new realization, and may have brought in spirituality, but I don't think he compromises on his basic model of writing.
He's a voice of honesty.
Yeah, he's a voice of honesty, and he lets things flow if they will in him, and whatever different urges exist, he tries to put them together as his own experience. So he is a poet of deeply felt emotional experience, and his emotional truth is, I think, more important than anything else. So, and within that, he's still very critical of the way America has moved forward. So, in that sense, I don't think there is a change or shift in the ideological position of the writer, or a kind of a newfound resolution in religion, but I think he keeps going back and forth and keeps returning. As he says, his poem is an unfolding process, so I think is his life, and which cannot be put in any rigid terms, which is why he's celebrated, in different subcultures, because he refuses to fit in any kind of a rigid model of any sorts. So
any connection of his poetry with what you call the subcultures in the latter part of his life?
So he was constantly in touch with these musicians and fellow writers who were also writing different kind of stuff, writing novels, etc. He was singing his own songs and was a part of this culture. Also, the influence of Dadaism is there on his work. There is a surrealistic train, where obviously the fact that he's imagining Whitman and walking with Whitman and talking to them as if they exist in the supermarket, even in absentia, also is to is a kind of a time lapse, you could say, of sorts. And he is trying to bring these together as a kind of a montage, where the past and the present seem to work together in a model, giving some kind of an answer to the poet in the present time.
With me, the way you describe him, I think he is also campaigning for something now. He is becoming more socially active. He sings, he talks to the audience.
He was always in the forefront of any social protest movement, and any place where he thought that people's freedom of expression was being compromised, or freedom to assert themselves was being compromised. I think he was in the forefront of any such movement, any subculture that existed, whether it was, as I said, the queer community that wanted to assert itself in 1969 or so, or it was the anti-drug wars that were being done, or the Vietnam War. Right, so these were things that he felt passionately about, and he was vocal about them throughout in his works. So I think this constitutes, and the use of pop culture, of course, whether it was in alternate music as against the mainstream music, or for that matter it was poetry, jazz. He tried to build on these experiences.
So where do we reach finally?
I think we reach nowhere.
That seems to be the voice of queries Ginsberg.
Yeah,
You know,
because Ginsberg wouldn't have wanted to be put in any category except that he was anti-state, anti-establishment, except that he felt very strongly that individual freedom was at stake when conformity, social conformity, I think was something that he was very much against, and because he thought that social conformity meant individual sacrifice.
So, friends, on this note of continuity in literature, where you start with protest and start understanding things still more in the latter part of your life, and you gain a kind of wisdom. I mean, I straight away am taken to Wordsworth. That initially he was a poet of rejection, but finally became a poet of understanding and wisdom. So the same kind of thing can also be said about him. Please think over these things, and Dr. Richa Bajaj has made many very important seminal points about not just the poet that she has discussed, but also the culture that produced this poet. So there are lots of questions, and I think it has been a very useful kind of representation of Howl and of the poet who wrote it. Thank you.